The baby's soft coo cracked the room like a fault line, the sound innocent and round as a pearl rolling across a church floor, a sound that once calmed nerves but now dragged them taut like wire across an empty lot at midnight. Clara bent over the bassinet and stroked the downy swirl at the crown of his head, her voice syrupy sweet, her breath shaky, the words too careful to be casual. "Look at our little man." That word, "our," didn't land. It ricocheted and lodged behind the ribs, an embedded shard the body could not push out or ignore, a syllable turned into handcuffs. Everyone was here because Clara insisted it would feel right to celebrate as a family, and because pretending had become a ritual, we all knew the moves too, even the ones that required smiling on cue and passing the potato salad while the air felt like glass. My parents sat together on the floral couch they bought the year they paid off the mortgage, a couch I learned to read on, a couch that had survived wine, summers, and my first broken bone, while across from them, Clara's mother clasped a paper napkin like a rosary and her father watched the door as if the sun itself might walk in and make all this make sense. Her sister, Mara, held her phone like a knife and didn't look up. Mara always could track the weak currents under any conversation, and today she was trying not to drown in them. "Is everything okay, David?" Clara asked, that too bright cheerfulness that sounds like something trying to be human and almost making it. The baby blinked open 2 blue coins and made that soft pout before sleep takes him. I felt the echo of a reflex. I'm the one who hums Johnny Cash off key and paces the hallway at 3 a.m., then crushed the thought under a boot I had laced tight for this exact moment. Because the truth was here, heavy and white as a sealed envelope on the sideboard, loud even in its silence, a bell whose toll everyone felt in their bones without knowing the name of the dead it marked. I handed the baby to my mother, who took him like a relic and stood, because she understands ceremony and the way endings need posture to feel real. The envelope made the kind of crack when opened that people think only exists in movies, a rip that tells the brain, no going back, no edits, the cut has been made and the body must adjust around the missing piece or bleed out trying. Clara's hand did that little tremble, the one I first saw when she read her grandmother's eulogy, when words were a river threatening to take her with it, and she scanned the page, 2 paragraphs, 3 identifiers, 1 conclusion that the lab rendered sterile but the soul hears as thunder. "This can't be right," she whispered, and the way the room held its breath was almost tender, like even the house didn't want to embarrass her grief by rustling a curtain or settling a beam. "It's right," I said, and my voice sounded like a stranger's, calm, clipped, carrying an executioner's routine dignity, the mercy of precision when feeling would make a mess. "Leo is not my son," hung there, and in the first second it felt like no one caught it. In the next, everyone dropped everything else to keep it from shattering on the floor. Clara's mother made that sound people make when they realize the ocean is further away than they thought, and the undertow already has their ankle. My father's jaw ticked in a way that means he is doing the math of harm against the math of justice, and finding no common denominator. Mara's eyes slid to Clara's and then away, a verdict and a prayer in one motion. "Who is his father?" I asked, but not to be told. I wanted the air to say back to her what she had given me to breathe for months, a gas that mimics oxygen until the knees buckle. "It just happened," she sobbed, a phrase that is less an explanation than a spell people cast, as if chance could be the father of a child and no one would have to wear the face of choice. The anger didn't arrive. It revealed itself like a building the fog had been hiding, hard lines and steel, a shape my body already knew how to enter and exit, an architecture mapped by insomnia, and the way coffee stops helping when the mind is solving for betrayal. "Pack your things," I said, pointing at the door that had, until today, been the frame for our small rituals. Keys on the dish, shoes kicked off, the thin laughter of Tuesdays that never made it into photographs because who photographs Tuesdays? "And take him" landed like a heresy, and I felt my mother's eyes on me, her hand hovering over the baby's shoulder a moment longer than necessary, as if virtue could be transferred by touch. Clara's face did that collapse people think only happens on stages, a folding in on the axis where the pride used to be, and she said something about where she would go and how a baby needs his crib and his chair, and the giraffe rattle that squeaks in the wrong key. "He's not my baby" came out colder than intended, like I had set it in the freezer for later and forgotten it there until it burned my tongue, and the horror that flashed across the room made me want to apologize to the furniture for making it witness this. But I didn't apologize, because something else had stepped forward inside me and taken the microphone, something that believed in declaring borders when maps lie. When the door closed behind Clara and the baby's carrier clicked against the porch step, it felt like the house exhaled and the old air left with them, taking the years that make a marriage feel like a river instead of a hallway. My mother asked if I was sure, and I said yes with the quiet of a verdict that will not be appealed. I learned that tone from the surgeon who told me after my high school injury that the ligament was non-viable, and the only way was through. Through meant I drove to the gym, where the man who wasn't a stranger anymore to me would be, because routine betrays the unrepentant, and rage can read a schedule like sheet music. He smiled before he knew my name, and then he didn't, and the things that followed were the kinds of things a man does when he wants to make a feeling into an event, and events into consequences, and consequences into something that feels like order in a world that refused to be orderly for 8 months and 2 weeks and 3 days. Later, the police station was fluorescent and kind in the way institutions get when the story is clean, and the paperwork is simpler if the penitent signs the line without smudging it. I told them what I did, and they told me what it was called. Somewhere, in a town that had loved her bouquets and her careful emails and the way she remembered birthdays, Clara became the subject of other people's afternoon coffee, and I became my father's lesson about self-control, told in a tone that forgives me without absolving me. I wish that were the whole story, that the envelope and the door and the gym and the station were the long and short of it, a straight line etched into a day that could be circled on a calendar, the day everything ended and therefore began. But what a day cannot hold, a life must, and the life that followed that day would prove that silence isn't only what follows a bomb. It's also the sound that fills a room when someone says the one true thing no one else had the courage to say aloud. Grief behaves like weather patterns. It circles back with the seasons, it remembers afternoons by smell, and it punishes the proud by arriving on a day that looks innocent until it isn't. In the months after the sentencing, time stopped being days and became tasks. Report in, count backward from 10, breathe when told, forgiveness, if it exists, hiding in the same corners as contraband prayers. The echo of knuckles on bone doesn't fade, it just gets filed under things that made sense for one terrible minute, and everyone has a drawer like that, and every drawer sticks. People told me I was brave, and people told me I was a monster, and the only difference between the two was whether their sister had once sobbed those words. It just happened, in a kitchen that still smelled like cake from somebody's party. A counselor with the eyes of a man who has stood at the edge of many people's nights said, "Name what you want without naming who you want it from." And I understood it was time to tell the truth about the intention that had steered every bad choice and every good restraint. I wanted to belong to a room without wondering if the windows were mirrors, to hold a child without needing a lab to tell me what that meant, to hear the word ours and not taste iron. Inside, routine makes saints of some and stone of others, and I learned the grace of repetition, push-ups, letters unsent, psalms misremembered and still effective, and the way a body can grow around absence like a tree around a fence post. The nights were long enough to teach honesty new definitions. It stops being a virtue and becomes a measurement, like telling the nurse where it hurts using numbers that mean nothing until the face says, too much, and brings another dose. When release came, it sounded like a door opening and a pair of shoes waiting, and a sky too complicated not to be forgiving. The move was a map folded until the creases remembered for me where I was meant to go. The new city had the decency to be ugly in honest ways, scuffed brick, an honest river coffee that burned a little and woke up everything that had slept on purpose. Work was work, the kind that keeps hands busy and lets the mind sort boxes with labels like what happened and what I did and who I am, labels that bleed if the hands aren't steady. On a Tuesday, because it's always a Tuesday, a woman asked for help lifting a bag of potting soil at the hardware store, and her laugh had a crack in it that let the light through without asking for permission first. Her name was Elise, and she did not ask easy questions or let me give easy answers, and in that way she resembled the kindest teachers and the worst storms, the ones that remake the coastline so thoroughly the old maps look like a lie. She asked about the scar on my hand, and I told her it was from a radiator hose and not from a bad night in a good gym, and then went home and wrote her a letter I never sent about the difference between before and after. The second time we met, she brought a plant that only blooms when neglected and said she thought that was funny. And I said sometimes the heart is like that too, blooming in the ruin, and we both laughed like we were glad to be overheard by the rows of paint chips that promise oceans and deliver kitchens. I didn't tell her about the envelope then, or the door, or the gym. I told her about the river and the way the city hums under the bridges, and how my father used to fix things by taking them apart, which is an approach to love that doesn't always scale. She told me about her brother, who left and didn't come back, and how absences take up space like furniture, and make the living room smaller without adding a seat, and we nodded at the kind of emptiness that can be shared without being solved. We learned each other's schedules and gentle alarms, like how she says hold on when she means hold me, and how I say it's late when I mean don't leave yet, and how two careful people can build a house out of simple sentences and borrowed time. And then the message came, as messages do, signaled by a vibration that doesn't belong in a pocket so much as in a chapel, and I stepped outside to read it because some words need air to do their work. It was Mara, and the line was clean as a cut. "He's sick," followed by a photo of the baby, no, of Leo, because names carry their own theology, hooked to a machine that makes a sound like someone else breathing for you. "He needs a donor," they're testing, but, and then the kind of ellipsis that makes men drop tools and kneel over memories like graves they forgot to visit. I sat on the curb and remembered the way he blinked, the way the crown of his head felt like a promise someone else had made in my name, and how I had said words I cannot unsay and meant them because meaning them was the only door I saw then. Elise came outside and did not ask what was wrong. She sat down and placed her hand on my back as if to keep me from leaving the planet while I read those words again and again, like repetition could turn the tide back at the shore. I had wanted to belong to a room without doubt. Now a room I had left forever had reached out like a hand in the dark, asking for something only the body can give without permission from the past. What do you do when the life you saved yourself from asks for help in a language only blood can translate? I thought of the test, and the way science can be right about percentages and wrong about obligation, and the way a man's intentions grow up when they meet a child's need. Mara wrote again, "Please at least talk to her. He's innocent." And the only thing louder than the truth in that sentence was the train that passed behind the hardware store just then, dragging 100 cars of steel toward some other story's climax. Elise said, "Tell me everything," and I did, all of it, badly and with the stops and starts of someone who has learned to be careful with nouns, and when I was done, she didn't look away. "You have to see him," she said, not as a command but as a way of returning me to myself, and I realized that sometimes mercy is just someone reminding you that the person you are at your best is still available to you if you're willing to be brave in the direction you swore you would never walk again. I texted Mara, when and where, and watched the 3 dots appear and disappear like a lighthouse, deciding whether we were worth saving. Hospitals distill human sound into small, supervised versions. Laughter gets filed into folders, crying is absorbed by carpet, and apologies wear soft shoes. The pediatric wing holds heroes and heartbreak like neighboring rooms in a motel, doors separated by ice machines, and the complimentary breakfast that never tastes like home. When I walked in, Clara was already standing, as if she'd been warned by a bird or a dream that the day would have to be rearranged to make room for me. For a second, the years fell off her face, and I saw the girl who cried in the back row at an R-rated movie we snuck into in college because she hated violence more than she hated rules, and then the second ended, and we were the people we had made through our choices. Leo, nobody called him anything else here, slept with the kind of sleep that makes a room angry at the sun for leaving so soon, and at the moon for being such a spectacular liar about safety. The machine said he was breathing, and the line said his blood was arguing with something too big for words, and the nurses had that gentle steel you only learn when you've stood in this kind of weather long enough to name its shapes. "Thank you for coming," Clara said, and her voice was a field after fire, black and quiet and somehow still hopeful, because the soil remembers how to be a future. Mara stood by the window like a bailiff who loves both parties and hates the law and is determined to keep the room from burning down again. "They're testing all likely donors. It's complicated," Clara said, and then the word complicated did the heavy lifting it always does when details would damage the already fragile scaffolding holding up today. We both knew the math. I wasn't his father, which made me both unnecessary and, in a cruel turn, a possible match if the world decided to play a trick that could save a life and burn a past at the same time. "I'll test," I said, and Clara closed her eyes like a church closing its doors at night, not to keep anyone out, but to keep the prayers from evaporating while everyone slept. The nurse explained forms and risks, and the timetable that makes people realize time is elastic and cruel and infinitely precious when it's wearing someone's small face. While they took my blood, I watched a mural of whales and stars, and remembered when I painted the nursery blue, because she said the sky feels closer when the walls agree with it, and how I traced one tiny constellation in pencil inside the closet where no one would see it and wrote his name above it. The nurse said results would come fast because the universe of tests becomes nimble in the presence of children whose names the staff already uses like they belong to the family. We waited in a lounge with a coffee machine that hissed like a tired cat, and Mara told a story about how Leo insists on handing each stuffed animal to the next in line before falling asleep, as if he knows we all need an introduction to rest. Clara folded and unfolded the same tissue until it gave up and became a soft, damp nothing in her palm, and finally she said, "I was lonely." And then we were back in the house 8 months earlier, and the river of excuses that aren't excuses, and the way need wears other people so convincingly we forget to ask for ID at the door. "I know," I said, and surprised myself by meaning it because knowing isn't forgiving, but it is, sometimes, the only way to let the poison drain without puncturing a new artery. I was proud, I added, and watched her look up, confused, until I said, I wanted to be the kind of man who could not be lied to, and that wanting made me deaf. And she nodded like someone who has discovered a map etched on the inside of a wound. Elise texted, "How is he?" And I sent a photo of the mural instead of the child, because sometimes love is protecting other people from the contours of your particular cliff. She wrote, "I'm outside if you need me." And when I looked up, there she was beyond the glass, hands in pockets, pretending to read a plaque about community donors, which is the most beautiful sentence in the English language when you need it to be. I waved her in because you do not refuse daylight when it volunteers to come through a window you weren't sure could open. Results arrived with the nurse's knock. That means we are all about to rearrange our faces to fit the news. Not a match, she said, and there was a mercy in being told quickly, like a bandage pulled by a friend instead of a stranger. Clara fell forward into her hands without sound, and Mara reached for her the way sisters do, the archive of shared childhood turning into muscle memory that catches falling adults. Elise hugged me like a question with an obvious answer. Stay, help, be useful. Don't make this about penitence when it's about a child whose favorite color changes daily. I found things to do, juice, a better blanket, asking the nurse the same question twice to signal that I would be here long enough to be a nuisance, and therefore a help. We waded through the tests of men whose names were whispered with old anger and new fear, and through the nights that teach that hope is a muscle that tears to grow. On the third night a match appeared, and the room breathed in stereo for the first time in days, and the machine softened its insistence, and the doctor spoke charts and contingencies like a weather report from the coast, saying the storm would likely glance off the cape and spare the town if the town remembered to board the windows anyway. The donor would remain anonymous, a phrase that tastes like gratitude mixed with cosmic humility, and the operation would be soon, and the risks were the kind that responsible people rehearse in their heads until the words mean less and the eyes mean more. We touched the bassinet rail the way parishioners touch wood that has absorbed 1,000 years of prayer, and in the quiet, I realized that the sentence that had once ended a life, "He is not my son," had become the prelude to another sentence. This is still my responsibility, because love is sometimes jurisdiction without biology. The operation day began with sunrise doing its best impression of a blessing, pink at the edges, gold at the joints, sky wide open like a held breath finally released. In pre-op, the anesthesiologist made jokes that had survived 1,000 mornings because they work on fear like sand works on oysters, irritating until pearls happen. Clara kissed Leo's toes and said something only mothers say that manages to be both ridiculous and sacred, and Mara filmed the ceiling for a second by accident and then kept the footage because sometimes the wrong angle tells the truth better. Elise stood beside me and pointed out a smudge on the glass that looked like a heart and said she didn't believe in signs, but she believed in noticing, which is almost the same thing when the stakes are children and mornings. I told her the thing I had not told anyone, that when I said take him, part of me was trying to save the part of me that still had a shape under the avalanche, and another part was demanding payment from the world in its own currency, which is cruel, which is human. She nodded and squeezed my hand because love doesn't argue with the worst parts. It keeps them company until they forget the door is open. Surgery is hours passing in a room that behaves like a clock, where each second is named and accounted for, and we pass them with coffee and walking, and the kind of conversation that's half inventory and half litany. When the surgeon finally came, he wore the face of a man who knows how quickly language can sink or save, and he said the words that let the room sit down. It went well, and we'll watch closely, and he's strong, a sentence that does magic without asking for applause. Clara cried in a way that folded no longer into forgiveness or blame, just into relief, which is the gentlest kind of collapse. In recovery, I stood at the edge of the crib, careful not to call it a crib because hospital furniture hates domestic words, and I whispered the chorus I used to hum in the hallway months ago when the night wouldn't negotiate with fatigue. Leo's lashes trembled like the beginning of a storm and then settled, and I realized there are lives you're drafted to defend even after you resign your commission, and that this, too, is an honorable service if humility is worn correctly. Clara looked at me and said, "I'm sorry," and this time the words sounded like labor, like something born through pain that might live. "I'm not coming back," I said, because truth prevents secondary infections, and she nodded because truth also prevents false hope from metastasizing in the soft tissues. "I know," she said, and then, "Thank you, not for coming, not for testing, not for the coffee, but for staying until the map shifted, and we all agreed to continue walking in the same direction for as long as the path required." Mara took our picture from a distance by accident, 3 people and a child, and a window full of collected light, and later sent it with no caption, which is the kind of restraint saints and sisters practice. At home, Elise made soup and played a song with a banjo that shouldn't have worked but did, and we talked about the word hours like two people, considering adopting a stray word from a shelter and wondering if they could give it the yard it needs. If we ever have a child, she said and stopped, and I finished, we will tell the truth even when it wrecks the day, and we both nodded like people who have seen what lies do to the load-bearing walls. That night the city hummed, and somewhere a train counted freight cars like beads, and I slept without the dreams that replay decisions, which is a grace old prayers call by many names. The next morning, Clara texted a photo of Leo's hand gripping her finger, and the caption said nothing but somehow said, "We are still here," which is the only headline some days deserve. I wrote back a heart, which is not language but is a bridge, and set the phone down and watched the light move across the floor like nothing had ever happened and like everything had. When the call came from the caseworker about paperwork and protections and the future, I took it and spoke calmly and felt the soft hinge of a life that opens in the middle and still holds.